So let's be clear. This genocide continues, this death machine keeps going because the ruling class, that includes our elected officials, our own government, and the billionaire elite, they all work together to keep it going, to keep this genocide as it is.
Salam, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Popular Cradle. My name is Rhiannon, of course, and I am here with co-host Muhammad. How's it going, Muhammad?
Hey, Rhi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing good. We are missing Yara today. She is off for this episode. So the main topic of our episode today is going to be about Jeffrey Epstein. But before we get into that, I think we should turn to what's happening around Palestine right now. One big thing, very impactful, Georges Abdallah, longtime political prisoner in France, the longest serving political prisoner in Europe in modern history, has been released. Georges Abdallah, of course, a Lebanese militant, a resistance fighter who was imprisoned by France. He is now back in Beirut as of July 25th. And immediately upon his release from prison, immediately upon landing in the airport in Beirut, speaking about Palestine, the urgency, speaking about the need for the Arab masses to rise up.
Right. And I think it came at a moment where the focus has become on the role of Arab countries, right? Arab governments, the role that Egypt has played in sustaining the siege on the Gaza Strip and actually in preventing the masses of people around the world from confronting the siege, just like we saw earlier in the summer with the March to Gaza or the Tunisian convoy. And so this clarity that George Abdullah brought couldn't have come at a better moment, because this is also a moment where we're seeing people actually make their way to embassies, Egyptian embassies and consulates all over the world, chaining the literal doors of these embassies shut as a symbol of the siege itself. And at the same time, we're seeing these mobilizations against Egypt. We're also seeing mobilizations against BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, one of the core organizations that orchestrated the plans, both for the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Fund, the body that's now essentially created these death traps for Palestinians to line up for a measly amount of food only to be massacred in lines for that actual food. And BCG, GHF, and all of these different affiliated groups are feeling an immense amount of pressure from mobilizations, from actions, from the actual controversy of being involved in this plan, and also the sort of day after plan, this Riviera of the Middle East that Trump has proposed, this plan of ethnic cleansing. And so George Abdullah, and as political prisoners do, as they are the compass of our struggle, gives so much clarity to this moment and the need for us to act and move. And his release from prison, as he said, was a victory achieved through the resilience of the campaign to free him. And so we felt it was really important to mark this moment and to cover what's been happening in Palestine. At the same time, we feel it's important to sort of address a topic, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, that has consumed a lot of attention, but we want to actually approach it from an angle that we feel is different than how it's been discussed in whether it's mainstream media or even a lot of alternative media, especially within the sphere of right-wing media. And that is telling the story of Jeffrey Epstein from the standpoint of Palestine and Zionism, to tell this story as really a story of imperialism.
Yeah, so the way Jeffrey Epstein has really always been discussed, but even more acutely and so much attention being paid over the past few weeks, is this man who is this creepy billionaire finance guy. He owned an island, a private island in the Caribbean, where, of course, it was revealed that he ran a sex trafficking ring that included minors, young girls. And this sex trafficking implicated politicians, celebrities, other billionaires. And so, this story has been in the media for years. Of course, he mysteriously died in jail, but there has been a reignition of attention on this. And it's especially coming actually from the far right and right media.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main issues that, for the right wing, for the Trump administration, or at least important officials inside of the Trump administration, people like Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, or, for example, Dan Bongino, the deputy director of the FBI, these people really made their careers, gained the notoriety that actually allowed them to become a part of the Trump administration. These people were obsessing over Jeffrey Epstein. We're obsessing over not just Jeffrey Epstein as the story, the details, but around the idea that we must hold the people involved in this sex trafficking ring accountable. And so ultimately, when these people are in power and then begin to participate in the actual cover-up of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, that produces a reaction amongst the right. And these people, the Trump campaign and the people surrounding the Trump campaign, actually rode this populist wave of anger against, for them, what was perceived to be essentially a pedophile ring that implicated some of the most important figures in American politics, media, culture, and so on. And so I think the Trump administration failing to deliver on promises made in terms of sort of what they would do to expose this pedophile ring, to prosecute these people, to bring these people to justice, this has created this backlash and ultimately this interest. But truly, for our sake, the problem with this right-wing narrative that's sort of honed in on that aspect of this story that's tied to the sex trafficking and blackmail and then people like Tucker Carlson is that they paint an incomplete picture of the reality of Epstein and his story and the people he's linked to and the intelligence agencies that facilitated his rise and the crimes he was committing over the span of decades.
Yeah, people are really demanding answers about Epstein right now. But I think what we want to talk about is how the main discourse about Epstein and the people who are demanding these answers, they aren't looking deeper. They aren't looking like behind the sordid headlines. And this conversation also has been completely ceded to the right, to right-wing commentators and right-wing media. And there are important answers that the left that we should be seeking. And a lot of this actually has to do with Palestine.
And so, like for us, I think what interests us about this story is less so this narrative that's emerged or the way that it's being used as a political football between Democrats and Republicans, and more so about really understanding what the Epstein scandal is actually about. And it's our contention that actually the Epstein story tells us a lot about the function of the world, the function of imperialism, the nature of our ruling class, and the global system, the system of imperialism that governs the lives of billions of people and subjects them to exploitation and oppression. And specifically, we want to look at this story from the lens of Palestine and more accurately from the lens of Zionism and how Epstein and the people he was connected to actually played an integral role in advancing Zionism and what that might tell us about Epstein and the billionaires he ran with and their links to Israel, Zionism, and the Mossad.
Yeah, I think with the Epstein story, like why this is important from our perspective, from the left perspective, from our perspective in the Palestine movement, it's not just that Jeffrey Epstein was a sex trafficker for billionaires. That is a scandalous and disgusting part of his story, certainly. But what popular discourse right now is missing by being kind of hyper-focused on that and that alone is what a figure like Jeffrey Epstein and the people around him and the class that he represents, what it reveals about how those billionaires, in conjunction with political leaders as well, how they run the world, how they exploit the rest of us, like you just said, Muhammad. They send the rest of us into forever wars and they impose great structural and economic and military violence on the masses of the world who amount to nothing to these people, to the ruling class, For these billionaires, it's regular people who can be taken to a Caribbean island and sexually exploited, and they can be violently harmed, and it doesn't matter. And it's the same billionaire class that will never be meaningfully held to account for those crimes. But you're able to see this parallel then with the impunity that's enjoyed by this billionaire class and also enjoyed by Israel and the United States globally, while the crimes of imperialism are waged on the global south, right? And so those parallels exist because of a fundamental interest convergence between the ruling class and empire. And so a figure like Epstein shows not just deviance, not just like sexual violence or pedophilic conspiracy or even like interpersonal blackmail scheming, but also like the villainous nature of a class structure, an imperialist world order where their business dealings, their social relations, and really like overt political and intelligence agency involvement of these people at the top. We're taking the mask off of these figures who are responsible, yes, for the trafficking of young women and also responsible for genocide, right? And so this is what like we should be uncovering when we talk about like a deep dive on Jeffrey Epstein.
And so I think let's go ahead and get started with actually, Epstein's story and who he was connected to, like what actually allowed him to gain the positions that he gained and the role that he played and why he was playing that role.
Yeah, let's give a really brief rundown. So Jeffrey Epstein was hired for his first job as a math teacher at an elite private school by the principal of that school, Donald Barr. Now, side note, Donald Barr's son is Bill Barr, Trump's former attorney general during Trump's first term. And during his tenure as attorney general, Bill Barr oversaw the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's death in jail and announced that Jeffrey Epstein had died by suicide even before that investigation was complete. And so it's Bill Barr's dad, Donald Barr, who had hired Jeffrey Epstein for his first job as a math teacher. But really quickly, that job fizzled out. There were allegations, of course, that Jeffrey Epstein left that job because of complaints about his behavior, particularly towards female students, young women.
Another interesting side note is that Donald Barr himself was an officer for the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, which I'm sure is a complete and total coincidence and has nothing to do with the trajectory of neither his son nor Epstein
Jeffrey
himself.
Epstein's life. Yeah.
Right. Totally unrelated, but just a side note.
And immediately after that, again, no college degree, kind of failed math teacher, was immediately hired into Bear Stearns, the investment bank, where Jeffrey Epstein learns about how billionaires keep, hide, move their money around.
And I think what's important about this is he's specifically hired to help facilitate the actual movement of money. Like this is the niche he develops. And he was specifically skilled at laundering money or hiding money, what are called tax shelters. And he didn't last long because ultimately I think he got a little bit too cocky, a little bit too brazen, and was investigated by the Security and Exchange Commission or the SEC. And so Epstein, from a really early point in his life, is able to demonstrate his utility to the ruling class. And it shows that criminality doesn't mean the same thing for the masses as it does for the capitalists at the top of this pyramid. So this is where we can transition to really talk about the main figures that he was connected to. And not from, some of, if you've watched or listened to any of the podcasts related to Epstein, these are the figures that you're probably going to be familiar with. But usually their story is told from the standpoint of their relationship to Epstein. What we really want to focus on is these figures' relationship to Zionism and the fact that ultimately they were critical in advancing Zionism as a political and ideological project on the one hand, but also as a project of actual settler colonialism in its military form, right? And supporting the Mossad, for example, as an intelligence agency in smuggling weapons to Zionist militias before the state of Israel even existed. Like on a very practical level, they were supportive of Zionism. And so these figures, we're looking at them and we're naming them as ideologically or politically driven Zionists, not to contrast them, for example, with other Zionists like Bill Clinton or Donald Trump, but instead to focus in on their specific role and their connections to the actual organized project of Zionism, which is best expressed through the state of Israel itself and its various agencies like the Mossad. And so I think the first figure we can look at or we can think of is Les Wexner, and he's a billionaire co-founder of Bath and Body Works. He was also a founder of Victoria's Secret. And actually, not to get into the details of it, but, Victoria's Secret would go on to act as a sort of hunting ground for Jeffrey Epstein in terms of his sexual predation. But Les Wexner's relationship with Epstein spanned multiple decades. He was Epstein's primary client and is credited with much of the wealth that Epstein mysteriously accumulated. And in fact, I think it's through Wexner's actual business dealings that Epstein was able to garner over $200 million. And beyond that, Wexner transferred so many different assets into Epstein's name and actually even gave him power of attorney over his estate. And so Epstein's relationship with Les Wexner is deep and critical to his connections and networks and the eventual role he would play for so many other billionaires like Wexner. And so Wexner, to turn this back to the relationship between Epstein and Zionism, was critical to the founding of this informal group of Zionist billionaires called the Mega Group. And the Mega Group included so many other Zionist billionaires, heirs to major companies, people like Charles Bronfman, the heir to the Seagram Liquor Company, people like Michael Steinhardt, a hedge fund manager who also donated billions to Zionist causes, and actually, as we speak, sits on the board of the Foundation in Defense of Democracies, which is this right-wing think tank that authors so many of the positions of, for example, the Trump administration. People like Ronald Lauder, the heir to the Estee Lauder Cosmetics Company, the same man who would go on to serve as U.S. ambassador to Austria, which also coincidentally happens to be the same country that issued Epstein a fake passport that would allow him to actually make his way to Israel to avoid prosecution. So his attorney, famous Zionist propagandist Alan Dershowitz, can negotiate him a sweetheart deal that allows him to only do a short stint in prison in the mid-2000s. And so the Mega Group, specifically this informal network of Zionist billionaires that actually includes so many others that we're not going to be able to talk about today, they contribute to the cause of Zionism.
Yeah, they call themselves kind of like philanthropic Zionists, right? Or philanthropic supporters of Israel.
And they were critical to two projects. First, the reinvigoration of Hillel International, which at this point in time was facing some sort of financial crisis, and which, for those who aren't familiar, Hillel is located on almost every campus across North America. And it's meant to be sort of the Jewish center of life for Jewish students on campus, but ultimately it doubles as a pro-Israel Zionist advocacy group. And in fact, has rules specifically about reinforcing Zionism and excluding anti-Zionist Jews, for example. And the other group is Birthright Israel, which is a project that's meant to kindle a relationship between Jewish students and youth in North America and Israel itself by taking them on trips on essentially what are propaganda tours. And the idea is to build the future Zionist by bringing these students to Israel. And these are just two projects of them that I think are on their face, obviously problematic insofar as we understand Zionism to be this fascistic settler colonial project, but on the softer end of what we would understand to be Zionism. Actually, the Mega Group itself wasn't just a project that was meant to do these like sort of philanthropic, as you described them, Marie,
Exactly.
they were actually seen as an arm of the Mossad. And actually, the NSA, or National Security Agency, the body that's tasked with signal intelligence and cybersecurity,
Mhm.
an agent working for the NSA described the mega group as a vehicle for influence operations in the US itself. And there's actually a story that at one point there was this like letter given to Yasser Arafat during the Bill Clinton administration. This would have been in the late 90s, that was meant to spell out the terms of the negotiations between the US government and the Palestinian Authority at the time. And the Netanyahu government wanted this letter. And I think, Ree, you know this story really well.
Yeah, the Israeli government, they wanted the letter. They wanted to see what was the contents of the letter that had been given by the U.S. State Department to Arafat. So they intercepted, they wiretapped a call between a Mossad agent in the U.S. and a Mossad agent in Tel Aviv, and they're talking about how to get this letter. And they're referring to getting it from Mega. They're using the word Mega. You know, the guy in the US is saying, well, maybe I can ask Mega for it. And the guy in Tel Aviv apparently says, no, we don't go to Mega for this kind of thing. So
Right.
the United
We use them for other things. Yeah.
Right. The United States, listening to this, having wiretapped it, listening to this, begins to suspect that maybe there's an individual they're using a code name Mega to refer to.
Yeah. Someone who's infiltrated the US administration. Right. So now they're having to do a counterintelligence investigation into who Mega is.
Mhm.
Now, you know, the theory is like Mega is referring to the Mega group, right? Like this group of billionaires that were critical to like advancing the cause of Zionism in the US. So this is just broadly how we could describe Mega, but like, what is Jeffrey Epstein's link to Mega? Like beyond his individual relationships with each of these billionaires, probably facilitating money laundering for them, he also used them to actually build up his own network of contacts in business and politics and media and Hollywood and various other industries. And Wexner, obviously someone that for Epstein was a huge benefactor. And, you know, being the sort of face of the mega group, played a real strong role in actually using Epstein as the tool that both his billionaire partners needed for things like money laundering or hiding vast amounts of wealth or facilitating that wealth's transfer to serve agencies like the Mossad or the CIA. But truthfully, the details of these things we will never know completely.
Yeah, another person we have to talk about, another billionaire Zionist with ties to the mega group and with very close ties to Jeffrey Epstein, is Robert Maxwell. You know, Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein had a close relationship over the course of decades, beginning first in the mid 1980s. Epstein likely helped Maxwell launder and move money, just like Epstein did for many billionaires. And Robert Maxwell actually introduces Epstein to a key figure in Epstein's life, Robert Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, who listeners, of course, know was Jeffrey Epstein's longtime girlfriend, a co-conspirator, co-criminal actor in the sex trafficking ring, and who is currently serving prison time for the role she played in that. Now, Robert Maxwell, her father, was this British media mogul, a billionaire, like I said. He owned at various points publications like the Daily Mirror in the UK, publishing houses. He served in British Parliament for a time. And in the early 90s, he's like one of the most famous people in Britain with this vast media empire. But really importantly for this story, and maybe the most dominating or primary role Maxwell had in his life, was that he was a Mossad agent. Before he was a billionaire media mogul in the 1940s, before even the state of Israel was created, Maxwell played a key role in smuggling weapons to Zionist militias in Palestine. You know, he's said to have been critical, like in the development of military air force capabilities for Zionist militias. This is before the IDF was ever even conceived. And once Israel does become a state and Maxwell continues to be amassing wealth, he is a willing and enthusiastic and ideologically supportive tool for the state of Israel and for the Mossad. one story maybe to illuminate in terms of Robert Maxwell's influence and work as an agent on behalf of Israel. There's this story where back in the mid 1980s, there's this software company that develops a new case management software, basically for law enforcement and for governments. It's called Promise. And as this company in the United States is looking to sell this software to governments and law enforcement agencies all across the world, Israel is very interested in how it can use this software to its advantage. And Israeli software engineers get a hold of this case management software, the Promise software, and they bug it. They bug it so that anybody who is using the software, whatever you're using it for, whatever information you have downloaded, whatever those case files are that you're using the software for, it's going to be seen by the Mossad, right? They install basically a backdoor into this software. Now, enter Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell is said to have sold the bugged Promise software, the software that has the backdoor for Israel's Mossad. He is said to have sold this software to institutions in the United States, like the Los Alamos National Laboratory. You know, this is like the biggest and most important nuclear research facility in the United States at that time. And he's doing this on behalf of the Israeli intelligence. And again, this is somebody that Jeffrey Epstein has a very, very close relationship with. Maxwell also is reportedly responsible for the 1986 extradition of an Israeli whistleblower, Mordecai Vanunu. You know, Vanunu was someone who came as a source to British newspapers to reveal that Israel had nuclear weapons, a nuclear program, even though Israel had denied that. Maxwell tipped off the Israeli embassy that Vanunu was sharing this information to the press, and Israeli intelligence then used this honeypot scheme to persuade Vanunu to go to Rome, where Mossad agents detained this guy, took him back to Israel, put him on trial, and sentenced him to prison for 18 years. And so this is the man, this is a figure that Jeffrey Epstein not only has a very close relationship to, but somebody who introduces Epstein to his social circles, somebody through which Epstein makes other famous relationships, like with Prince Andrew, like with the Clintons. It's Robert Maxwell who introduces Epstein to all of these people and is incorporating Jeffrey Epstein over the course of decades in Maxwell's political, business, and intelligence dealings.
And yeah, I think Maxwell actually was the person who connected Epstein to Douglas Leese, who is relevant for our story because he was a British arms dealer that was close to a person named Adnan Khashoggi. And actually, Douglas Leese was described as Epstein's mentor, even though at one point when he's interviewed, Epstein completely denies even knowing Douglas Leese. But as far as Adnan Khashoggi goes, he's a really important figure, and I think people would recognize his last name because he's actually the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, who was butchered by the Saudi government in their embassy in Turkey.
Washington Post journalist, is that right? Or Wall Street Journal?
Correct, yeah, the Washington Post journalist. So Robert Maxwell connects him to Leese, who then connects him to Adnan Khashoggi, and Adnan, Epstein are at the center of the Iran-Contra affair. And I think it's important to focus in on this actual scandal itself, because Epstein, while his name has come up historically as playing sort of the money man role in the actual equation, it's important to sort of explain how this story illuminates imperialism, this operation during this moment in time in history. So the CIA, specifically at the direction of the Reagan administration, had decided to circumvent basically Congress's ban on arming the actual Contras, the Nicaraguan paramilitaries, these death squads that are engaged in essential genocide in Nicaragua in an attempt to defeat the Sandinistas. And what they do is, in order to get around Congress, they basically go to Israel and go to Iran, who's in need of these weapons in this moment following the revolution because they're in the middle of this war with Iraq. And they tell Israel, look, if we give you these missiles as a way to bypass Congress's ban, we're asking you to give missiles to Iran, and Iran in turn is going to transfer funds to the actual Contras in Nicaragua. And so my guess is Epstein is at the heart of this because he's the person who's going to actually facilitate the financial transaction from Iran to the Contras. He's going to be able to move the money from banks to shell companies and ultimately into the hands of the Contras themselves. And Adnan is the person who connects them to Iran, who's able to actually facilitate this deal because he's ultimately an arms dealer and Iran needs weapons and he knows they need weapons. And so you can imagine that this is the story of US imperialism in this moment, right? Israel as a proxy for counter-revolutionary activity globally, the playing of both sides in the Iran-Iraq war because the US at this time is arming Iraq and in fact giving them the chemical weapons that they're using against the Iranians. They recognize that the Iranians need weapons to actually fight this war and they think to themselves, we can weaken both sides at the same time. And they're also wanting to finance a counter-revolutionary movement in Central America to ebb the tide of socialism and communism in Latin America.
Right.
And Epstein is at the center of this story. And Epstein is connected through these various other figures that are ultimately themselves connected either directly to Israel, the Mossad, or the CIA. Or the MI6, in the case of Douglas Leese, he was probably connected to British intelligence himself. And so this scandal, this like one story, which everyone kind of like at this point in time probably has forgotten about in terms of the Iran-Contra scandal. But at this time was one of the first scandals, following, for example, Watergate scandal involving President Nixon at the time where he wiretapped the DNC's office and broke in and stuff like that. But not to digress, the main point that I'm trying to say is like Epstein's sort of linkage to these figures of Zionism goes back decades. And at the center of this, honestly, like we talked about Epstein and we talk about Zionism and US imperialism, but Adnan Khashoggi himself is really the story of Arab reaction. And here, Arab reaction means like really the far right, the right wing that is critical to sort of US imperialism in the Gulf, but the region more broadly. And here we can see that its operation is actually global. And Arab reaction, Zionism, and US imperialism with their shared interest are actually through this criminal enterprise that links all of these specific figures together, these billionaires, because Adnan himself was a billionaire, ultimately, though he went broke just due to the amount of spending he engaged in. Adnan himself was representative of a class of Saudi billionaires that were deeply intertwined with Zionism's project in the region. And in fact, Adnan himself has actually served as the principal foreign agent of the US in their operation of the Safari Club, this like covert alliance of intelligence services that ran clandestine operations throughout Africa. And they actually formed this alliance with specifically Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco, and to an extent, France, US, Israel, Rhodesia, and apartheid South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And this was obviously running clandestine operations against nationalist governments, against revolutionary, socialist, communist, anti-colonial governments throughout Africa. And so Adnan features in this story as representative of the role that some of these Arab billionaires, these reactionary individuals played in this broader global system of imperialism.
Yeah, we're talking about these figures, kind of these assorted activities, histories, and the interconnectedness, how they all meet each other and end up working very closely with one another. And so, what is it actually that this system that we're describing that Jeffrey Epstein is a part of? If Jeffrey Epstein is a starting point or an entry point, or at least a peephole, let's say, into the system, well, what are we describing? And I think what we've been saying is that Jeffrey Epstein, his relationships, his utility in those relationships, the way he, as a billionaire money launderer and somebody involved in organized crime, how his interests converged with all of these other people's interests, people committed to Israel and Zionism in many different ways. Well, this reveals actually how imperialism is working. This reveals how a ruling class actually drives imperialism, makes the decisions that fuel the imperialist machine. And of course, in many ways, that includes Zionism as well. You know, Mohammed, we've been chatting like a lot about this episode. I've been intaking like a lot of information and discussions and reading about Jeffrey Epstein. But I think you summed it up really well a couple of nights ago when we were talking about this. And you just said, like, what this shows is that, like, imperialism is a global criminal enterprise.
Right,
We're talking about how billionaires are involved necessarily. What Jeffrey Epstein shows us is that billionaires are involved in organized crime. Billionaires are involved in money laundering, and billionaires are involved with intelligence agencies all over the world, of course, the CIA and the Mossad included. And so what does that tell us? That tells us that imperialism itself is this global criminal enterprise, of course, one whose crimes include the mass violence, include genocide in Palestine, include poverty all over the world in the global south, right? All of these things. And so what we're saying here is that Jeffrey Epstein's life, his role, and his relationships and connections to all of these figures shows that, like, the ruling class in this system, by definition, engages in organized crime, money laundering, intelligence agency warfare. And it doesn't matter necessarily, like, quote unquote, like what side of the political aisle they're on, right? Like it's Bill Clinton, it's Donald Trump, it's Robert Maxwell, it's Les Wexner, it's Ehud Barak, it's all of these people from all over the world. And actually they end up on the same islands and at the same parties and at the same weddings, right? And so it shows a consolidation of interests and relationships in this small ruling class that ultimately is driving the imperialist machine.
Right. You know, like on a baseline level, the way you can think about it is, and we've discussed this in prior episodes, like imperialism has these various legs that it stands on, right? And the two primary legs being military and economics. And another leg that's usually not described or named is the ideological leg. And these figures, if you break them down, like if you actually cast the set of characters that are central to each of these legs, these people have names. They're tied to industries, and they have networks, and they have accumulated wealth, and they're tied to the state in a very specific way, but they're also tied to the media. They're tied to banks. They're tied to so many different things. And these figures, they participate in the project of sustaining global capitalism, not for global capitalism's sake, but for their own interest, because they see their interest as tied up into one another, in terms of their shared property, their shared wealth, their shared endeavors, and also in their ideological projects that they see serving imperialism, right? And so that's expressed through their desire to monopolize media, for example.
Yes.
Through acquiring all of these different media industries, newspapers, publishers, etc. And you know, people like Robert Maxwell, or let's say Rupert Murdoch, or whoever it might be, they understand this very well, and that's why they pursue things both for a profit and motive, but also because they're ultimately committed to a project that their interest is tied into in a very clear way. They understand it more than anyone else does. And Epstein in this story is one of those tools in the legs of imperialism.
Yes.
Because ultimately, at its core, what is his role? He's a money guy and he's a network guy. He's a fixer. He perfected a system that probably involved some level of blackmail, no doubt, but probably for tactical competition between these people, not so much as differences on overall strategy or their participation in this global system. It's like getting one on over each other because there's no honor among thieves ultimately in this game that they play. And Epstein played his role really well. And probably, for him, he played it for the highest bidder. And these people had a lot of money to give, and they were connected to a lot of powerful people. And so it should be no surprise to us that people like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, people who represent two opposing, seemingly, political parties, and Rupert Murdoch, the mega mogul of Sky News and Fox News, and Tom Barrack, the American private equity and real estate investor, obviously a close friend to Trump, and the current U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and so many other figures, Wexner and Maxwell and Lauder and so many other names. It's honestly, the names are endless. And even heads of criminal organizations, like here, I mean like literal criminal organizations as defined by the U.S. criminal code, right?
Mobsters.
Mobs, mafia, whatever it might be. Like these people, like they're all on the same team. Now they compete with one another. Some people want to be starters. Some people don't want to come off the bench, but ultimately they're all playing against us.
Right.
You know what
exactly.
I mean? Like we're, and listen, the game is rigged. They write the rules and like, it's not a pretty fight. Let's just say that. But at the end of the day, I think the main thing to understand from this Epstein scandal is that Epstein is actually not unique whatsoever. And sexual perversion, if I had to pathologize these people, is probably just this is what we call bourgeois decadence, They have all of this wealth. They've pushed all of these boundaries, and that they would take steps to engage in rape and sexual assault of minors should not be surprising. I think most recently the PYM put out a post regarding Epstein, and I might as well quote from it because the ending was really good. We should not be so shocked that a class that immolates children daily in Gaza also traffics and sexually abuses them.
This is it, right? This is it. This class of people does mass violence across the world. What we're seeing in Gaza is like, probably the most top of mind. But the imposition even of poverty, the extraction of resources from the global south into the imperial core, right? Like the very economic system that we are crushed under, right, is a product of what this ruling class does. And so this is why we say it shouldn't be shocking then that on, an individual level, these people have a propensity for extreme violence.
And I think that's what's been missed a lot in the discourse. And there's two things that I want to say about this. Is first, like, largely the political currents within this country that are actually interested in this subject is found on the right. And I think that's a failing of the left, honestly. First, because I think that, the right, while it gets lost in some of the details and frames things from a specific lens that either redeems capitalism, redeems the U.S., redeems like the core project of U.S. imperialism by saying, well, this is a product of blackmail. Like the moral deviation that's taken place here is the consequence of these nefarious actors intervening in an otherwise noble system, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge flaw. And then, or you have this obsession that becomes almost a scapegoating of a people or an intelligence agency, right? That Epstein's problem is that he was connected to Israel or connected to Jewish billionaires or connected to the Mossad, when he was also connected to so many billionaires that weren't Jewish, for example, right?
Yeah.
Political actors that were left and right. And by left, I mean left in name only, right? Liberals, really, like Bill Clinton, for example. And so I think that when that narrative has taken hold, it leaves people with a misapprehension about Epstein and the reality of the system that produced someone like Epstein and the role he played for that system. That's one. The second thing I will say is like the left's failing in actually taking this up is that, first of all, people care deeply about the things tied to this person. First, on a very visceral and natural level, people care about children. People
Yeah.
care about minors. People care about crimes that involve sex trafficking, right? And the abuse of children. That these are of a concern for us just as much as it is for anyone else, as a left, as an ideological or political left. And so we owe it to people to actually understand Epstein, it's his scandal, how it ties to intelligence agencies and billionaires, how it ties to our ruling class, and to actually give our own assessment and framework for understanding this development so that we can understand Gaza or counter-revolution in Latin America or the monopolization of media through a shared or holistic lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most significant intervention we can make as a left, is to reach people where they're at. And they're on Epstein right now. They're on this subject. And I think, the right has really capitalized on a populist fervor. And I think there have been few figures on the left that have been able to do that, right? To really draw in on people's basic concerns. And on a moral level, this is one of them. And so the left, really needs to occupy that space.
Yeah. I think on the left, I think our analysis is so often maybe stuck in a structures and systems level. But what we see when we critically engage these individual figures themselves, Jeffrey Epstein and the billionaires around him, is how the output of that structure is operating, right? The things that are created by these structures and these systems are these billionaires, is this elite ruling class that seem to live on a different planet than you and I, who are wholly unrelatable almost to the average person in values, in interests, in lifestyles. And these are the people ultimately who are making the decisions that affect all of us. And so this I think we can't cede to the right or to reactionary discourse, right? We shouldn't just be stuck on no, we analyze structures and systems. We need to look at okay, well, the structures and systems, this machine, what was the output? What came out of this? What came down the factory line?
Yeah.
Is somebody like Jeffrey Epstein? Is somebody like Robert Maxwell? Is Ghislaine Maxwell? Is all of these people? And to think about what it is that they do and what they represent in this system is critically important to our understanding of the system, right? I think another thing the right kind of misses on this also, it goes to this populist moment that we're in, and I think it hits people in a motivating way, but I think ultimately wrong is, you hear, for example, a Tucker Carlson type talk about how one of the problems with Jeffrey Epstein is that it shows, let's say, an alliance to a foreign government in Israel. And that kind of alliance, that these kinds of close ties where the U.S. ruling class, the U.S. government is, kind of prioritizing relations with Israel and its interests in Israel and the government of Israel. Well, that hurts. That's sort of demeaning or destructive of what it means to be an American citizen.
Yeah.
Right? Like that this is a threat to you as an American citizen and your rights as an American citizen. As an individual American, you should be the top priority of the US government, let's say. And look, it's not that's necessarily wrong. This is why it hits this populist moment, because the masses expect that their governments should be actually working in their interests, right? And should be serving them and should work for them. This is correct. But I think what I reject about this argument is the sort of exceptionalization, what is being said about being an American citizen to the exclusion of everybody else, right? That you're special in your American citizenship, that you are a small group of people, that, other people shouldn't be entering that group. That's something that I think the right kind of spins out sometimes in stories that show the US government's interests converging with other governments, especially Israel.
I just want to comment on the previous point that you made about sort of naming individuals and actually articulating their role in the system, and how the left has gone away from that and instead opted for, more structural critiques, right? And I think that, this is in part a product of both the academy, like academia, and media itself, sort of vilifying the notion of a conspiracy theory. And I think conspiracy theory itself is like a term like that once at one point it had a lot more capture, but used to be used to sort of discredit someone, that they're a conspiracy theorist for articulating the connections between people or the gaps that exist between the story we're being told and reality and stuff like that. On the one hand, there are obviously plenty of conspiracy theories, and some probably planted by the CIA or FBI or governments.
Yeah, whole divisions of like psyops. Yeah.
Yeah, they engage in these information operations that are meant to sort of confuse people. But at the same time, conspiracies are a real thing. Like, our world is organized, and there are individuals involved in organizing our world, like making sure the world functions in a very specific way. These are politicians, these are people in media, and at the highest levels of culture and arts, and so many different institutions and stuff like that. And these people have interests together, and they actually work to advance those shared interests. It's not as though they're all operating independent of each other, moved by this amorphous force that directs them, based on their own individual sort of cognitive thought processes. No, like, there's a reason they're all in the same room and attending the same party and marrying into the same families.
Yes.
Like, the thing about it is, like, if you actually break down, and I hate to be the guy that busts out the
dictionary,
the whiteboard. No, the whiteboard with the charts and the strings connected to people.
Yeah.
But that shit is actually real. Like, there are strings and there are photos and there are people connected.
Right. It's just like, it's just using words. Like, it's the definition. Like, the people are conspiring with one another. This is right. This is it's not fantastical. This is the conspiracy is the fact.
Yeah. And they want us to like run away from that and say, no, it's like, oh, it's on a basic level, white supremacy, or only imperialism. It's like, no, these people have names.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they have children who continue doing the things that they were doing.
And all their children go to the same elite schools with one another, right? Whereas your kids might have a remote chance of getting into one of these elite institutions, right? But your kids will be, beat up by the police there for protesting genocide,
No, listen, I conspire to host a Saturday night dinner with a board game night. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I conspire.
Right.
Their agenda is a little bit different.
It's on another level for sure.
Yeah.
For
They're
sure.
like,
the playing field is different.
How do we coup this like country?
Yes.
To capitalize on their resources, and what are the people that we need to tap for that? And how much money is it going to cost us? And what is our return? Like, that's the agenda. For me, it's like, who's bringing like the salad, you know what I mean?
The lettuce.
Yeah. Like, who's bringing the dessert, Like, that's the extent of my conspiracies.
So that brings us to the end, I think, of our conspiracy to do this episode. We know it's a really wide-ranging conversation, but we hope what you're taking away is that in somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, we see not just an individual criminal actor, not just an individual who exploited young women, but an individual who had relationships inside the billionaire ruling class that reveals that reveals the inner workings, the reality about how people at the head of this criminal imperial system operate. And so thank you so much for joining us. We will see you for the next episode of Popular Cradle. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.